She said polyamory was just evolution, but I found her messages planning secret dates while I was paying for everything. I never thought I'd be the guy scrolling through someone else's tablet, but there I was, staring at evidence that would change everything about what I thought we'd built together. I'm Mason, 31, working as a renewable energy consultant here in Portland, and for 2 years I thought I'd found someone who shared my values about building something meaningful and lasting. Victoria was this freelance photographer with an artistic eye and what I believed was genuine depth, the kind of person who could talk about social justice and environmental consciousness with real passion, someone who seemed to value authenticity and emotional growth as much as I did. We'd been living together for 8 months in this cozy 2-bedroom apartment in southeast Portland, splitting expenses mostly fairly, though I'd been covering more of the rent and utilities lately since her photography business was still growing and she needed time to develop her artistic vision. I genuinely supported her creative pursuits, even when it meant tighter budgets and longer work hours for me to compensate. That Thursday evening started normally enough, with me helping set up her new tablet for editing photos while she prepared dinner, when a notification popped up from someone named Dante with a preview text that made my stomach drop instantly. I opened the message thread while she was in the kitchen making her famous lentil curry, thinking maybe I was being paranoid or misreading the situation, but what I found was weeks of flirty exchanges about wine tastings downtown, intimate conversations about connection and authenticity, and detailed plans for meetups that had definitely happened while I was working late on solar farm proposals for my consulting firm. The messages weren't just friendly acquaintance chatter, they were romantic and deeply personal, filled with inside jokes and references to physical chemistry, philosophical discussions about how traditional relationship structures were limiting their spiritual growth and personal evolution. Victoria had been positioning herself as this enlightened free spirit exploring deeper connections, while I was apparently the conventional obstacle standing in the way of her self-actualization. When I heard Victoria's footsteps coming back from the kitchen, I quickly screenshotted several of the most damning conversations and set the tablet down, my heart pounding as I realized I was about to confront someone who'd been living a complete double life while lecturing me about emotional honesty and authentic communication. I took a deep breath and asked her directly about Dante and the wine tastings, expecting maybe embarrassment or apology or at least some acknowledgement that she'd crossed obvious boundaries, but instead she immediately flipped the entire script, accusing me of violating her privacy and exhibiting exactly the kind of toxic possessiveness that was holding back our relationship's potential for growth. She launched into this prepared-sounding speech about how modern relationships had evolved beyond outdated monogamous structures, calling me emotionally stunted for not embracing polyamorous ideals, as if I was the problem for not being enlightened enough to accept her secret dating life as some kind of gift to our partnership. The way she seamlessly shifted from being caught red-handed to playing the righteous victim was honestly impressive in its calculated precision, wrapping straightforward infidelity in progressive relationship rhetoric like she was teaching me some advanced graduate course in human connection and emotional intelligence. I sat there listening to her explain how my attachment to exclusivity was a symptom of masculine insecurity and patriarchal conditioning, watching her transform my completely reasonable expectation of honesty and commitment into evidence of my emotional immaturity and spiritual stagnation. This wasn't just cheating, I realized as she continued her lecture with growing confidence. It was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as enlightenment, and I was supposed to thank her for the education while apologizing for my backwards thinking and commitment to outdated relationship models. Instead of giving Victoria the dramatic confrontation she clearly expected, I did something that apparently threw her completely off balance. I quietly agreed that maybe we wanted different things and started planning my exit strategy with the same careful attention to detail I used for complex renewable energy installations. While she spent the next few days attending her freelance photography workshops downtown, convinced she'd successfully reframed the narrative and trained me to accept her new relationship philosophy, I was systematically dismantling our shared life with methodical precision that would have impressed my engineering colleagues. I found a month-to-month studio apartment across town in the Alberta Arts District, arranged for professional movers to come during her Thursday workshop schedule, and began the careful process of separating my belongings from hers without creating any drama or giving her ammunition for future victim narratives she could spin on social media. The whole operation took 4 days of precise coordination, and I felt oddly calm throughout the process, like I was finally taking decisive action instead of absorbing endless cycles of her psychological manipulation and gaslighting disguised as relationship growth. What made the situation even more surreal was discovering, while packing my home office and organizing important documents, that Victoria had been documenting our relationship conflicts for her authentic living blog, painting detailed portraits of me as the controlling partner while positioning herself as this brave free spirit breaking chains of patriarchal oppression and traditional relationship structures. I found multiple drafts of posts about toxic masculinity and emotional unavailability that were clearly about me, complete with fictional conversations that made me sound like some kind of possessive monster for expecting basic honesty and commitment in what I thought was supposed to be an exclusive relationship. She'd been monetizing our private struggles and intimate moments, turning my reasonable requests for communication and transparency into content about masculine fragility and spiritual awakening, building her online brand and follower base around the narrative that I was holding her back from authentic self-expression and personal evolution. Reading those draft blog posts was actually liberating in an unexpected way because it confirmed that Victoria didn't see me as a partner worth communicating with honestly, but rather as raw material for her personal brand development and victim story construction. I realized she'd been performing enlightenment and progressive values while practicing calculated manipulation, using trendy relationship language to justify behavior that was simply selfish and fundamentally dishonest at its core. The moving day itself was almost therapeutic, watching my entire life fit neatly into labeled boxes while leaving behind the expensive camera equipment I'd purchased for her birthday and Christmas, along with all the kitchen gadgets and furniture we'd bought together during happier times when I thought we were building something permanent. I left everything that belonged to both of us, taking only what was unquestionably mine, because I wanted a completely clean break without any future arguments about property or financial obligations that could give her reasons to maintain contact. My final act was leaving a simple handwritten note on her desk next to her laptop where she wrote her blog posts. Your liberation is complete, and I respect your choice to explore connections outside traditional structures, so please respect my choice for no contact moving forward. I blocked her number and all social media accounts before she even returned from her workshop that evening, knowing that she'd likely try to control the narrative of our breakup just like she'd controlled everything else through emotional manipulation and progressive rhetoric designed to make me question my own reasonable expectations. When I finally settled into my new studio apartment that first night, eating Thai takeout on the floor surrounded by boxes and my carefully packed belongings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine peace and the complete absence of walking on eggshells around someone's volatile emotional needs and constant demands for validation. The silence was incredible, not the tense quiet that came before one of Victoria's emotional storms, but actual peaceful silence where I could think clearly without anticipating the next crisis or manipulation tactic disguised as spiritual growth. I unpacked my engineering books and renewable energy journals that Victoria had always dismissed as boring work stuff, setting up my desk near the large window that overlooked a community garden where actual committed couples walked their dogs together without documenting every moment for social media consumption. That first week in my own space, I realized how much mental energy I'd been dedicating to managing Victoria's moods and trying to predict which version of her I'd encounter each day, whether it would be the loving partner or the enlightened guru who needed to educate me about my emotional limitations and spiritual deficiencies. Living alone in my minimalist studio apartment became an unexpected journey of rediscovering who I actually was beneath all the layers of compromise and self-doubt that Victoria had carefully cultivated over 2 years of subtle manipulation. I started noticing things about myself that I'd forgotten during our relationship, simple preferences and interests that Victoria had dismissed as boring or unenlightened, making me question whether I was really as dull as she implied. The first thing I did was join the rock climbing gym downtown, something I'd mentioned wanting to try but Victoria had shot down because she thought it was too aggressive and masculine, not aligned with the peaceful energy she was cultivating for her personal brand. Turns out I loved the physical challenge and the mental focus required, plus the climbing community was filled with genuinely supportive people who weren't constantly analyzing everyone's spiritual evolution or emotional availability. I also started attending community theater productions at the small venue near my apartment, rediscovering my appreciation for live performance that Victoria had mocked as pretentious middle-class entertainment for people who couldn't afford real culture. These weren't Broadway shows, just local productions with passionate actors telling stories, and I found myself looking forward to each weekend performance with genuine excitement I hadn't felt in months. Most importantly, I reconnected with my college friends Mike and David, guys Victoria had labeled as energy vampires who were holding me back from personal growth because they enjoyed things like fantasy football and craft beer instead of discussing chakra alignment and polyamorous relationship structures. We started having our regular Thursday game nights again, and I realized how much I'd missed having conversations that didn't require me to defend my basic personality traits or apologize for finding joy in simple pleasures. The transformation in my sleep patterns was probably the most dramatic change, going from months of restless nights spent mentally rehearsing conversations where I'd defend my right to expect honesty, to sleeping deeply through the night without anxiety about what emotional crisis might greet me the next morning. My appetite returned too, and I started actually enjoying cooking for myself instead of constantly calculating whether my food choices would trigger one of Victoria's lectures about mindful eating or environmental consciousness. Colleagues at work began commenting on my improved focus during project meetings about solar farm development, and my supervisor mentioned that my recent renewable energy proposals showed a level of creative thinking that had been missing for months. I'd been so mentally exhausted from managing Victoria's emotional volatility that my professional performance had suffered without me even realizing it, and now I was rediscovering the satisfaction of solving complex engineering problems without constant background stress. The best part was starting a dedicated savings account for a solo backpacking trip through New Zealand, something I'd always wanted to do but Victoria had dismissed as running away from emotional growth instead of facing relationship challenges with courage and commitment. I researched hiking trails and adventure photography, planning an itinerary that excited me more than any shared vacation we'd ever discussed, because this trip would be entirely about my interests and pace without having to accommodate someone else's need for luxury accommodations and Instagram-worthy moments. Every evening after work, I'd sit at my desk researching Milford track camping permits and Te Araroa trail sections, feeling genuinely enthusiastic about future plans for the first time in over a year. The financial freedom was remarkable too, watching my checking account balance grow each month instead of mysteriously shrinking due to Victoria's unexpected expenses and creative emergencies that always seemed to coincide with new designer releases or wellness retreats. I calculated that I'd been spending almost 40% of my take-home income supporting her lifestyle choices disguised as our shared expenses, money that was now accumulating toward actual goals instead of funding someone else's performative spirituality and authentic living brand development for her growing social media following. Victoria's carefully constructed narrative of liberation and spiritual growth began unraveling faster than I could have predicted, starting with the harsh reality that Dante had never been the enlightened soul mate she'd portrayed him as in her secret messages. Within 3 weeks of my departure, I learned through mutual friends that Dante was relocating to Seattle for work and had informed Victoria that he'd only been interested in casual encounters during his temporary Portland stay, not the deep spiritual connection she'd convinced herself they were building. The devastating blow to her ego was apparently immediate and visible, according to our friend Lisa, who ran into Victoria at the coffee shop where she used to hold her creative photography meetings. Victoria had apparently cornered Lisa for 45 minutes, desperately trying to explain how Dante's sudden departure was actually evidence of his emotional unavailability and fear of authentic intimacy, rather than admitting that she'd misread the entire situation and sacrificed a committed relationship for someone who saw her as temporary entertainment. Her backup options began evaporating one by one with almost comedic timing, as if the universe was delivering swift justice for her calculated manipulation and betrayal of our relationship. The yoga instructor she'd been flirting with at her weekend workshops turned out to be in a committed relationship with another instructor, something she'd apparently missed during all her enlightened conversations about non-traditional relationship structures. The coffee shop musician she'd been texting, the one she'd mentioned as being so creative and spiritually aligned with her artistic vision, turned out to be 22 years old and still living with his parents while trying to launch a SoundCloud career with songs about chakra alignment and crystal healing. Even more revealing was watching her blog content shift from confident proclamations about evolved relationships to increasingly desperate posts about masculine fragility and emotional unavailability, as if the entire male population of Portland had suddenly developed commitment issues rather than simply recognizing her patterns of manipulation and entitlement. Her followers began questioning her relationship advice in the comment sections, with several people pointing out the contradictions between her advocacy for authentic communication and the obvious fact that she'd been secretly dating while in a committed relationship. Victoria's meditation group leader, someone named Rainbow who apparently specialized in helping women release toxic masculine energy from their lives, actually contacted me through LinkedIn with a message about Victoria's spiritual crisis and need for closure with past relationship trauma. I politely declined to participate in whatever healing ceremony they had planned, explaining that I was focusing on my own growth and wasn't interested in being part of Victoria's narrative revision process. The situation escalated when Victoria enlisted her younger sister Emma to drive by my workplace, ostensibly to drop off some forgotten item from our shared apartment, but really to gather intelligence about my apparent thriving post-breakup life. Emma, who had always been the more grounded sister, actually ended up warning me that Victoria had been creating fake social media profiles to monitor my activities, spending hours analyzing my Instagram posts and LinkedIn updates for signs of emotional distress or new romantic interests. According to Emma, Victoria had become obsessed with proving that I was either secretly devastated by our breakup or already rebounding with someone inappropriate, anything that would validate her decision to leave and support her victim narrative about my emotional limitations. The most concerning revelation was that Victoria had been documenting our entire relationship timeline for her blog, planning a series of posts about recovering from toxic relationships and recognizing red flags in partners who seem supportive but are actually controlling through kindness and financial manipulation. Emma showed me screenshots of Victoria's notes where she'd reframed every thoughtful gesture I'd made as evidence of my possessive nature, every gift as a guilt trip, every shared expense as financial control, constructing an alternate reality where I'd been the manipulator all along. According to these notes, my willingness to cover more expenses while her photography business grew was financial abuse designed to create dependency, my interest in planning future trips together was evidence of controlling behavior, and my expectation of honesty about other relationships was emotional manipulation disguised as love. The psychological projection was breathtaking in its completeness, as if Victoria had taken every manipulation tactic she'd used on me and attributed them to my character instead, creating a narrative where she was the victim of subtle coercive control rather than someone who'd exploited a partner's generosity while conducting secret relationships. Emma also revealed that Victoria had been researching polyamorous relationship coaches and planning to rebrand herself as an expert on ethical non-monogamy, despite having practiced the exact opposite by lying and deceiving rather than communicating openly about her desires for multiple relationships. The irony was lost on Victoria, who apparently saw no contradiction between advocating for radical honesty in relationships while having built her exit strategy around deception and manipulation. Victoria's final desperate attempt at manipulation came 6 weeks after I'd moved out, when she orchestrated what she clearly believed would be an emotionally devastating encounter at Powell's Books on Saturday morning, knowing it was part of my weekly routine that I'd never changed. I was browsing the engineering section, looking for a book about sustainable architecture for my New Zealand trip planning, when I spotted her in the self-help aisle wearing the vintage leather jacket I'd given her for her 26th birthday, the one she'd claimed made her feel like an authentic version of herself. She was clearly positioning herself to be noticed, holding a book about healing from narcissistic relationships while occasionally glancing in my direction with what appeared to be carefully rehearsed vulnerability. When she finally approached, tears were already forming in her eyes, and she launched into what was obviously a prepared speech about seeing a therapist and realizing her mistakes, claiming she'd been working on herself and desperately needed just one conversation over coffee to make things right between us. I listened patiently as she described her supposed therapeutic breakthrough about how fear of intimacy had caused her to sabotage our beautiful relationship, how she'd been running from the depth of connection we shared because it scared her, and how she now understood that I was the most emotionally mature man she'd ever met. The performance was impressively thorough, complete with specific details about how much she missed our quiet Sunday mornings and the way I'd supported her creative dreams, but something about her delivery felt scripted rather than authentic, like she was reciting talking points designed to hit my emotional triggers. When I asked about her therapist and the specific work they'd been doing together, Victoria became evasive and eventually admitted that she'd actually been working with a life coach named Crystal who specialized in helping creative women overcome limiting beliefs about traditional relationships, someone she'd found through Instagram rather than a licensed mental health professional. I gently suggested that she might benefit from actual therapeutic support with someone who had proper training and credentials, explaining that real healing from relationship patterns usually took longer than 6 weeks and involved examining one's own behavior rather than focusing on how others had triggered defensive responses. Victoria's carefully maintained composure began cracking when she realized that her emotional manipulation tactics weren't having the desired effect, that I wasn't responding with the guilt or sympathy she'd been counting on to regain psychological control over the situation. Her voice grew sharper as she accused me of being cold and unforgiving, claiming that my inability to see her growth and give her another chance proved that I'd never really loved her authentically, that I was just like every other emotionally unavailable man who couldn't handle a woman's spiritual evolution. The mask slipped completely when I calmly explained that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation, that I genuinely hoped she found happiness and healing, but that our relationship had revealed fundamental incompatibilities in how we approached honesty, commitment, and mutual respect that couldn't be resolved through apologies or promises to change. Victoria's response was to raise her voice and accuse me of being psychologically abusive through my refusal to engage with her healing process, creating a scene that drew stares from other bookstore customers and ultimately reinforced my decision to maintain no contact. The most telling moment came when she demanded to know if I was seeing someone else, her desperation becoming obvious as she insisted that any new relationship would fail because I hadn't done the inner work necessary to be a real partner, that I was just repeating patterns of emotional unavailability with women who were less evolved than her. I watched several other customers witness her meltdown, including a coworker from my renewable energy firm who later commented on how composed and respectful I'd remained throughout the encounter, noting that Victoria's behavior had been concerning and inappropriate for a public space. As security approached our section, Victoria finally seemed to realize that her grand gesture had backfired spectacularly, that instead of winning me back or even making me question my decision, she'd simply demonstrated exactly why maintaining boundaries was necessary for my well-being and peace of mind. She gathered her things and left abruptly, but not before making one final attempt at manipulation by loudly declaring that she hoped I'd eventually learn to love someone the way they deserve to be loved, as if my refusal to accept her dishonesty and emotional manipulation was evidence of my inability to commit to authentic relationships. The entire encounter left me feeling oddly validated rather than upset, because Victoria's behavior confirmed every insight I'd gained during our time apart about her manipulation patterns. I finished browsing for my architecture books, purchased the ones I wanted, and drove home feeling completely certain that I'd made the right choice in ending our relationship and maintaining no contact despite her escalating attempts to regain access to my emotional energy. That evening, I called my friend Mike to debrief the bookstore encounter, and he pointed out something I hadn't fully appreciated. Victoria's desperation suggested that losing me had been a much bigger blow than she'd anticipated when she chose Dante over our relationship. The fact that she was still pursuing me months later, despite having claimed that polyamory was her authentic relationship style, revealed that her supposed enlightenment about non-monogamy had been more about justifying infidelity than genuine philosophical evolution about relationships. The promotion to lead renewable energy consultant came 3 months after my breakup with Victoria, bringing with it the responsibility for managing a major solar farm project in Oregon's Columbia River Gorge that would require extensive travel and site visits throughout the region. The irony wasn't lost on me that this career advancement, which represented everything I'd been working toward professionally, would have been completely impossible during my relationship with Victoria due to her constant need for attention and validation whenever I focused on work responsibilities. She had always managed to create some emotional crisis or urgent need for support precisely when I had important deadlines or travel requirements, forcing me to choose between my professional growth and managing her psychological demands disguised as relationship maintenance. Now I could accept challenging assignments without worrying about returning home to accusations of emotional neglect or lectures about work-life balance from someone who had never demonstrated any understanding of career advancement or long-term professional goals. The Columbia River project involved coordinating with environmental engineers, local government officials, and community stakeholders across multiple counties, requiring the kind of sustained focus and travel flexibility that Victoria had consistently undermined through her manufactured emergencies and attention-seeking behaviors. My dating approach had become much more intentional and selective, focusing on women who demonstrated emotional stability and genuine independence rather than the performative confidence that had initially attracted me to Victoria. When I met Rebecca at a renewable energy conference in Seattle, what struck me immediately was her genuine curiosity about my work and her ability to discuss complex environmental science topics without needing to position herself as an expert or turn every conversation into an opportunity for personal validation. Rebecca was a marine research scientist studying ocean acidification impacts on Pacific Northwest coastal ecosystems, someone whose professional passion and intellectual depth reminded me what actual compatibility looked like when both people brought substantive interests and goals to a relationship. Our first few dates involved hiking trails in the Cascade foothills and visiting tide pools along the Oregon coast, activities that Victoria would have dismissed as boring or insufficiently Instagram-worthy, but which allowed Rebecca and me to have genuine conversations about environmental conservation and scientific research without performance or pretense. What impressed me most about Rebecca was her response when I shared the story of my previous relationship and Victoria's manipulation tactics disguised as spiritual enlightenment and progressive relationship values. Instead of offering sympathy or trying to position herself as superior to Victoria, Rebecca simply observed that my ability to recognize unhealthy patterns and establish clear boundaries was an attractive quality in a potential partner, demonstrating emotional intelligence rather than the defensiveness or competitive behavior I'd learned to expect. Rebecca's independence was refreshing in ways I hadn't fully appreciated until experiencing it firsthand, from her insistence on splitting dinner expenses to her genuine enthusiasm for solo travel and research expeditions that took her away for weeks at a time. She never created drama around my work travel schedule or demanded constant communication during my site visits, understanding that professional responsibilities sometimes required focused attention rather than treating my career as competition for emotional resources. The contrast with Victoria's constant need for reassurance and validation was striking, particularly Rebecca's ability to maintain her own friendships and interests without requiring me to validate her choices or provide constant emotional support for basic life decisions. When Rebecca talked about her research on marine ecosystems, her passion was genuine and infectious rather than performative, and she showed equal interest in my renewable energy projects without trying to insert herself into every conversation or make everything about her personal growth journey. 6 months into our relationship, Rebecca mentioned that she respected my approach to planning and commitment, noting that my attention to detail and follow-through on promises made her feel secure rather than controlled, a perspective that highlighted just how distorted Victoria's interpretation of basic reliability and consideration had been. The healing process wasn't dramatic or marked by major breakthroughs, but rather a gradual recognition that I was no longer walking on eggshells or constantly analyzing my behavior for signs of the controlling tendencies that Victoria had convinced me were inherent to my personality. Rebecca never made me feel like I needed to apologize for my interests, my work schedule, or my preference for planning ahead rather than making impulsive decisions based on whatever felt spiritually aligned in the moment. When I told Rebecca about Victoria's accusations that my financial stability and career focus made me emotionally unavailable, she laughed and pointed out that those were exactly the qualities that made me an appealing long-term partner for someone who valued security and shared goals over constant drama and uncertainty. Most importantly, I realized that I wasn't healing from heartbreak but recovering from sustained psychological stress that I'd mistaken for normal relationship challenges, recognizing that what I'd called love with Victoria had actually been a trauma bond maintained through emotional manipulation. The final confrontation with Victoria came 8 months after our breakup, at our mutual friend Sarah's housewarming party in a renovated warehouse space in Portland's Pearl District, an event Victoria had learned about through her obsessive social media monitoring rather than receiving an actual invitation. I arrived with Rebecca, who was meeting most of my Portland friends for the first time, and we were enjoying conversations about her marine research and my renewable energy projects when I spotted Victoria near the industrial-style bar setup with someone I didn't recognize. She was clearly performing for my benefit, laughing too loudly and touching her companion's arm with the exaggerated intimacy of someone trying to provoke jealousy rather than expressing genuine affection, wearing a flowing bohemian dress that screamed spiritual authenticity and personal transformation. Her new partner appeared to be from her polyamory meetup group based on his carefully curated alternative aesthetic, complete with crystals and meditation beads that suggested he was deeply invested in the same performative spirituality that Victoria used to justify her manipulative behavior patterns. What struck me immediately was how desperate and calculated Victoria's entire presence felt, from her strategic positioning where I couldn't miss seeing her to the way she kept glancing over to gauge my reaction to her obvious happiness and evolved relationship dynamic. Rebecca noticed Victoria's behavior almost immediately, commenting quietly that someone seemed to be working very hard to make sure we knew how amazing her life was, demonstrating the kind of perceptive emotional intelligence that Victoria had always lacked despite her claims of spiritual enlightenment and psychological awareness. The most revealing moment came when Victoria's companion approached me privately while she was in the bathroom, confiding that Victoria talked obsessively about our past relationship and had been using their polyamory arrangement to avoid genuine emotional intimacy with anyone in their group. According to him, Victoria had positioned me as the emotionally unavailable ex who couldn't handle her authentic self, but her constant references to our relationship and defensive explanations about why it ended suggested that she was far from over the situation she'd created. He seemed genuinely concerned about her mental health and her inability to form new connections without constantly referencing her previous relationship trauma, noting that her approach to polyamory seemed more about collecting validation than building meaningful intimate connections with multiple people. When Victoria returned and saw me talking with her partner, her mask slipped completely, revealing the same desperate need for control that had characterized our entire relationship dynamic disguised as progressive relationship philosophy and spiritual growth. The breakthrough moment came when she saw me genuinely laughing with Rebecca and my friend group, sharing stories about our recent hiking trip and Rebecca's research expedition to study coral bleaching effects, conversations that flowed naturally without any performance or agenda beyond enjoying each other's company. Victoria's face went through a visible transformation as she realized that her psychological power over me had completely evaporated, that I wasn't angry or hurt or affected by her presence, just completely indifferent to her existence and focused on building something real with someone who actually valued authenticity over drama. Her new partner looked increasingly uncomfortable as Victoria's attention shifted from him to monitoring my interactions, clearly recognizing that he was being used as a prop in her ongoing psychological warfare rather than being valued as an individual worthy of her genuine attention and affection. The final straw came when Victoria approached our group uninvited, interrupting Rebecca mid-sentence about her research findings to announce that she was so happy to see me moving on and hoped that I'd finally learned to be more emotionally available in my new relationship. Rebecca handled the interruption with grace and directness, thanking Victoria for her concern but noting that healthy relationships don't require dramatic transformations from either partner, just mutual respect and clear communication, a response that highlighted everything Victoria had never understood about genuine intimacy and partnership. Victoria left the party abruptly with her confused partner, and I later learned through mutual friends that she'd moved back to her hometown in California within a month, abandoning her Portland photography business and authentic living blog when it became clear that her local social circle had witnessed too much of her manipulative behavior to continue supporting her victim narrative. Rebecca and I left the party early to watch stars from my apartment balcony, talking about our upcoming trip to New Zealand and her research opportunities in marine conservation, conversations that represented everything I'd thought I wanted with Victoria but had never actually experienced due to her constant need for drama and validation. The contrast was striking. Where Victoria had demanded constant emotional labor and created chaos disguised as spiritual growth, Rebecca brought genuine peace and partnership that allowed both of us to pursue our individual goals while building something meaningful together. As we planned our future travels and discussed career opportunities that might take us to different locations temporarily, I realized that true freedom wasn't about having unlimited options like Victoria's polyamory philosophy suggested, but about choosing wisely and protecting your peace from people who would exploit your kindness and generosity for their own psychological needs and personal brand development. The months following the housewarming party brought news through mutual friends that Victoria's move to California had been more of a retreat than a fresh start, with her photography business failing to gain traction in a more competitive market and her authentic living blog gradually losing followers who'd grown tired of her increasingly bitter content about toxic masculinity and relationship trauma. According to Emma, Victoria had been struggling to maintain the polyamory lifestyle she'd promoted, finding that most people in the California scene could quickly recognize her manipulative patterns disguised as spiritual evolution. The California polyamory community apparently had more experience with people who used alternative relationship structures to avoid genuine intimacy, and Victoria's approach to collecting validation rather than building meaningful connections was transparently obvious to more experienced practitioners. Emma mentioned that Victoria had been cycling through short-term connections that lasted just long enough for people to recognize that she was still processing unresolved trauma from her previous relationship rather than being genuinely available for new partnerships. Meanwhile, Rebecca and I had been building something completely different, characterized by mutual support rather than constant crisis management, and shared excitement about future possibilities rather than anxiety about manufactured drama. Our relationship had the kind of steady growth that Victoria would have dismissed as boring, but which actually represented the foundation necessary for long-term partnership between two people who valued autonomy while choosing to build something together.